Today's daf we're going to be learning is Pesachim daf tzadivav. Today's daf and the next month of our learning is sponsored by Terry Kravosha in memory of her beloved father Nachum Meir ben Dov Ber. As we mark the last day of his shloshim, Mary Oliver's words describe perfectly my father's view of life. When it's over, I want to say, all my life I was the bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. My dad, Judge Norman Kravosha, was a remarkable individual who did far more than simply visit this world. We miss his presence, but are honored by his memory. Yehi zechro baruch. Today's daf is also dedicated by Andrea Eisen in loving memory of her mother, Sandra Joy Singer. And with that, we'll get started with our daf. We were in the middle of a slew of questions by Rav Yosef, who was talking about a year when there were too many people. The majority of the people were impure. The majority of the Kohanim were impure. And all of a sudden, remember what happens? The Tumah becomes overridden, basically say, or pushed aside. Remember, we saw the debate whether it's overridden or pushed aside. And people are allowed to be Tme'im and come into the Azara. The question is, what if they went into the Echal? Or what if it's only Tme'im Eitim that are allowed? So what if other people who are Tme'im come in and they eat the sacrificial meat? Right? We have a bunch of questions about these things. Are they going to get karet? Or do we say already this is a whole different year going on and the regular prohibitions do not apply? So here's his last question by Rav Yosef. Dachakut me'em etim, we're at the very last line of Tzadi Hamabet. Dachakut me'em etim v'achlu imurei Pesach haba b'tumah. You need a little background. We've talked about the imurim before. The imurim are the parts that get burnt on the altar. Remember, the korban pesach is eaten by the people who bring the korban. However, there's certain parts which get burned on the altar. Those parts, what if, now you're not allowed to eat them, but not only are you not allowed to eat them, you're also not allowed, besides that you can't eat them and there's an issur about eating them, there's also an issur to eat them when you're tme'im. Just like the meat you can't eat when you're tameh. Also, when you're impure, also these imurim you can't. So now, what if it was a year where you're all of a sudden allowed to eat the meat when you're tameh because tumah hutra? So because of that, the tumah becomes permitted. Is it also, now, what does it become permitted for? In order to allow you, number one, to sacrifice the korban, number two, to eat the meat. But it never said you're allowed to eat the imurim because the imurim were never permitted to eat anyway. So the question is, mahu. Would you get karet for eating the imurim when you're not allowed to eat imurim when you're impure? So do we say, here are the two sides, like all his other questions. Since we already overrode the tumat basal and you can eat the meat, therefore you can also eat the imurim. O dilma, or do we say, my de ishtere ishtere, my de lo ishtere lo ishtere? And when they came to permit, they permitted what needed to be permitted, eating the meat. But since you're not supposed to eat the imurim anyway, they didn't permit the eating of the imurim. So Amarava, Michti, here comes his answer. Michti tumat imurim mehecheit rabi, mi tumat basar. Wait a minute. The whole law, how do we even know that if you eat the imurim when you're tameh, you're going to get karet? We only know that from the tumat basar, from eating meat when you're tameh. Which then he's going to say, if that's the case, in a year where there's no tumat basar, obviously there's going to be no tumat imurim, because the whole notion that you're going to get karet for it comes from the tumat basar. So in a year when there's no tumat basar, of course, there's not going to be a problem with tumat imurim. So let's read that inside. Dichtiv, asher la Hashem. Okay, you need the whole pasuk to understand what they're talking about. It says, the pasuk that talks about not eating meat that's impure says, v'hanefesh vayikra zayin pasuk bet, v'hanefesh asher tochal basal mizevach hashlamim asher laHashem b'tumato alav v'nichrata nefesh yimayameh. If you read that pasuk too quickly, specifically kind of read it a little quickly, you would basically say, what's this pasuk saying? Anyone who eats meat that's tameh from a korban shlamim, anyone that eats meat from a korban shlamim, zevach hashlamim, right, b'tumato alav, and you're tameh, you get karet, very simply. But there's two extra words in that pasuk. Whoever eats a zevach hashlamim, asher laHashem, that belongs to God. Now something doesn't make sense in that pasuk. Shlamim belongs to the owners. Remember, the owners get to eat the meat. So what are these extra words, asher laHashem? They come to teach you that also the parts of the korban that go to Hashem are also, which means they get burnt on the altar, are also included in this isur, okay, of, right, karet for eating them if you're tameh. So here, this comes to include the imurim, the parts that get burned. So therefore, when there is tumat basar in a regular year, then also you're going to have a problem of imurim. But if we're in a year where the majority of the people were tmeim and they overrode tuma, and everyone can eat the meat when they're tamei, then obviously leite tumat imurim. Then there's no tumat imurim, because the whole strength of tumat imurim, or the power of it, comes from tumat basar, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have even had a notion that it would be forbidden. Okay. Next question, but this time it's not Rabbi Yosef, it's Rabbi Zera, and this is the last one for our section. Before we get to the next Mishnah, I just want to point out something structurally about this. If you recall, yesterday we ended just before the Mishnah with this question, even though we were on a Mishnah that talked about what's the difference between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni, and it said that it's Dochesh Shabbat. And then we said, right, both of them are Dochesh Shabbat, they override Shabbat. And then the Gemara said, oh, it sounds like they override Shabbat, but they don't override Tuma, which is exactly how we got into Tuma Hutur B'Tzibur. But it's not really how we got into Tuma Hutur B'Tzibur, because really we got into Tuma Hutur B'Tzibur because of the next Mishnah. And that's an example where the Gemara often likes to connect the Mishnayot to each other. And just before the Mishnah started, it already got you thinking about Pesach Haba B'Tuma. So when you got to the Mishnah, your head was already in there. Well, same thing here. Right now, we're going to ask a question we're going to get to something about the way Pesach happened in Egypt, the year they got out of Egypt, right? And the Pesach, what we call Pesach Mitzrayim. And then that's going to be a lead-in to the upcoming Mishnah, which is all about the differences. We saw the differences between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. Now we're going to see the difference between the Pesach they did in Egypt and the Pesach for the rest of the generations. Okay, and what are the differences between them? And Shuli Mishkin, in Flashback on our site, wrote an article this week talking historically about Pesach Mitzrayim. So by Rabbi Zera asks, Imurei Pesach Mitzrayim hecha akterinu. They got out of Egypt now. It's true they took some gold and silver from the Egyptians, but they didn't take an altar with them, right? Where did they have an altar to burn the imurim on the Mizbeach, right? They didn't have an altar, right? So if you think about it, the Pesach was basically eaten, so not a big deal. You slaughter the animals and you eat the Pesach. You don't really need a Mizbeach. You need a Mizbeach for the blood, which we'll talk about what was in place of the blood in Egypt. But what about the imurim? What did they do with them? So Amarle Abai, Uman Lemalan de lo shviski avid. What makes you think that they didn't do it shviski? Okay, what's shviski? It's kind of a funny word. Says that they didn't roast it on a shipud, like on a what do you call it? A skewer. Now, why? What does that mean? Okay, two different explanations of what Abai is trying to say. One explanation is to say, who says there was even a law of imurim in Pesach Mitzrayim? No, they just put the whole thing on a skewer and they roasted the entire animal with the imurim and they ate the whole thing. And who's to say there was a concept of imurim? That's one way. Others explain Abai as saying, no, what he really meant was this, of course, they didn't have an altar. Well, what are you thinking? They walked out of Egypt with an altar. They had to, forget about the fact they didn't have time for their matzah to rise, right? Their dough to rise, and they ate matzah. Could you imagine trying to think about them sacrificing on an altar? So what's he saying? They took, what do you do in place if you don't have it? So they took a skewer, they put the imurim on the skewer, and they burnt them entirely on a skewer, right? You could leave your stuff on the barbecue and just have it burn entirely. They didn't do it on an altar, they just did it there. So it's a very interesting nafkamina, right? A relevant, whether it's not super relevant, it's something that happened and it happened once, it's not going to happen again. But if you really want to know what happened, there's really two explanations within Abai, which are totally opposite. One says there was no such concept of imurim, and one says there was, it's just they burnt it differently. They didn't use an altar because they didn't have one. Now he says, and furthermore, how do I know they didn't have an altar? Because Od Hatanya Rav Yosef, Gimel Mizbachot Hayusham, Ala Mashkof, Val Shtei Mizuzot. They had 3 altars, but they were a little bit of a different altar. Now, what's the altar really used for? Remember, we talked about the 4 main avodot, and they really all have to do with the blood, right? The burning of the parts on the altar are an extra thing. They're not the central part of the korban. Now, that year, they did have an altar. It was a different type of altar. It was the doorpost, right? The mashkof, the part at the top, and the 2 sides. And they put the blood on the doorposts, right? Remember that? They put the blood there. That was so that God would pass over. That was their, they took the animals, they slaughtered them, they put the blood, and then they ate the animals, right? It's the same idea as a korban. It's just they had something in place of a mizbeach. And then obviously you can't roast your meat on the doorpost. That's not going to work exactly. So that's why that year they didn't do it in that way. They had an alternative mizbeach. They didn't need an altar really, because again, the main part they were able to do in a different manner. Right? And there was no other, right? They didn't have anything else. Okay, new Mishnah. So as I said, this was a lead into our next Mishnah, which starts off, Ma ben Pesach Mitzrayim le Pesach Dorot. Right, very interesting. What are the differences between the Pesach in Egypt and the Pesach for future generations? Pesach Mitzrayim mikromi be'esor. Pesach Mitzrayim, they bought the animal on the 10th of the month. Okay, we're going to see that from the Pasuk. V'ta'un haza'ah ba'agudat ezov v'ala mashkof al shtei mezuzot. And they had to take it with a hyssop branch. They dipped the hyssop branch into the blood, and then they put the blood on, as we said, on the door, right on the top part and on the sides of the doors. And it was eaten in a hurry in one night. Now, this is a little bit strange because also the Pesach for future generations is eaten only in one night. So something about this doesn't make sense. We're going to have to wait till the next amud, the next side of the page, to understand what this is talking about. And likewise, the next line makes no sense either. Pesach dorot noheg kol shiv'ah. Pesach for future generations is for 7 days. Now, what do we mean? And Pesach, we assumed right now we're talking about the korban. The sacrifice is certainly not all 7 days. So we're going to have to figure out what are they referring to here. Gemara starts off with the first issue, which is you purchase it on the 10th of the month. So now they say, and that's only, they did that in Pesach Mitzrayim, but not for future generations. Minalam, where do we get this from? Dichtiv, as it says in the verse, Dabru el kol adat Yisrael lemor, ve'esor lachodesh hazeh v'yikchu. Tell the people, take, right, on the 10th of the month, v'yikchu, take. Take means in Torah language to purchase. Purchase your animals on the 10th of the month. Now, so why do you think it's just that year and not any other year, right? All the laws are given to them then, and many of them were for future generations. And that's going to really be what's going to be our main topic right now for the next few minutes, which is how are you going to derive what's what? So they say from here you learn, notice what it said, Be'esor lachodesh hazeh. Now the pshat of that means on the 10th of this month. Okay, but maybe you'd say, you don't need to say 10th of this month. We all know it's going to be this month. When else is God going to say, do it next month? So what's hazeh? This always means this and nothing else, right? Or this is coming at least to exclude something else. So what do they say? And this is going to create a lot of problems, this drasha. Zeh mikomi be'esor ve'ein pesach dorot mikomi be'esor. Okay, this one you have to purchase on the 10th of the month. But any other sacrifice, you don't, right? In future generations, when it comes to Korban Pesach next year, the year after, and right, you don't need to buy it on the 10th. So they say, if you're going to say the word zeh, they're now going to have 7 questions, okay? The first one's a little different than all the others, just because it's got a much longer question and a much longer answer. But elame'ata, from here, so that's why on the chart, I put the upcoming 6 questions, but not this one. This one I put in a different way so you'd see the structure. So now the question becomes like this. If we're going to say the word zeh, and this is going to be the thrust of all the questions, zeh is coming to exclude, okay? To say this and not other years. So then every time we see the word zeh or something else that's a word where it's going to be bo or mimenu, all these words which seems to say only this and not other times, why are all these laws true for future generations also? That's going to be the basic question. So now it's important to distinguish here between purchasing the animal and watching the animal. There's 2 halachot, and there are 2 different halachot. One is animal has to be purchased on the 10th, and another is you can only use an animal that was watched. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have purchased it early, but it had to have been watched for 4 days to make sure that it doesn't get a blemish leading up to the korban. And this is a law that applies also to the korban tamid. So we'll read this now inside. Ela me'ata. Now, if what we read before, and I brought all these psukim on your sheet, so it makes it easy for you. If you look at Shemot, Perek Yud Bet, that's HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, when God starts to tell them all the rules. So then it says, right, tell everyone Be'asur LaChodesh on the 10th. The first pasuk Gimel is on the 10th of this month, and that's what we just darshaned. Then it says, right, if you right, buy the animal. And then the whole issue, the next 2 psukim talk about the animal. If you don't have enough money to buy an animal, well, join with your neighbor. We saw these psukim already. Then it says it has to be male within its first year, all those details that we saw already. Now, Pasuk Vav says, V'haya lachem lemishmeret, you have to watch this, ad 14 yom lechodesh hazeh. So you have to watch this animal from when you purchase it. Now, number one, purchase it on the 10th. It's not enough to just purchase it 4 days before, but you have to watch it for the next 4 days. And notice what it says in that pasuk, lechodesh hazeh. It says the same thing. So you would assume that this law would only apply based on what we just said to Pesach Mitzrayim. But now we're going to see that that's not true. So we're going to say your drasha doesn't stand up to the test, because hazeh, if it comes to exclude, then also the laws of what we're going to call bikur, which is checking your animal and making sure, watching it for 4 days, does not apply to Pesach Dorot, and we know it does. But it's going to take us a little while to get there. So they say, hachanami, right? So if you, you're supposed to watch it. Are you going to say hachanami zetaum bikur? They call it bikur, okay, to watch. Zetaum bikur arba'a yamim kodem shchita ve'en acher ta'um bikur. You're going to say it's only for this and not any other sacrifice, not Pesach Dorot, and not what we're going to see the Korban Tamid. But we know both the Korban Tamid and the Pesach Dorot need shmirah for 4 days, and they actually learn it from this pasuk. Now, how do we see that? How do we know that's the case? Vahatanya, it says in a braita, Ben Bagbag Omer, Minayin letamid sheta'um bikor arba'a yamim kodem shchita. How do we know that the Korban Tamid? Now they're going to start. This braita has to do with the Korban Tamid. How do we know that the daily sacrifice, the animals they use for the daily sacrifice, had to be watched for 4 days before? Shenema tishmeru la'akriv li b'moado. It says the word shmirah here. Okay, remember that word. Tishmeru. Be careful to observe. La'akriv li b'moado, to do it at the proper time. Now they're going to do a gzerah shava from, remember, gzerah shava means the same root of the word appears in one place and it appears in another place. We're going to learn from one to the other. Where are they going to learn the laws that it needs bikor for 4 days? From our pasuk of Vayalachem lemishmeret arba'a yamin, because their shmishmeret appears, which is the same as tishmeru. So ulahalanu omer, elsewhere it says Vayalachem lemishmeret ad arba'a asar. Now there we know it's 4 days, because it says buy it on the 10th and watch it till the 14th. So it clearly needs bikor for 4 days. So malahalan, just like by Pesach, and it doesn't say Pesach Mitzrayim. It means just like by Pesach every year, we need bikor arba'a yamim kodem shchita. Afkan te'um bikor arba'a yamim kodem shchita. Likewise by the Korban Tamid. Now the topic of that braita is the Korban Tamid, but that's not what's important to us. What's important to us is the assumption of that braita is that the Korban Pesach every year needs 4 days of shmirah. Now, if you say you only need to buy it on the 10th, if it's Korban, right, when it was in Mitzrayim, because of the word zeh, then it seems like you only need shmirah. Now, it's very important to separate these two things. You could do shmirah without having to buy it on the 14th, okay, on the 10th. It just means make sure you buy an animal that's been washed for 4 days. So there's distinguishing, because in the end they're going to say, and this is why this sugya is a little bit confusing, in the end they're going to say the purchasing is really only, in the end they're going to answer the question, they're going to say the purchasing on the 10th was really only for Pesach Mitzrayim. For future generations, it needs bikor 4 days, but it doesn't mean you have to buy it on the 10th. Okay, so now, our question is, right now we're in the middle of the question. If you're going to say hazeh means only Pesach Mitzrayim, then hazeh by the shmirah should also only be Pesach Mitzrayim, and then this whole braita makes no sense. So what do they answer? Shanehatam dichtiv tishmeru. Okay, so number one, they say, well, there it says tishmeru, okay, which is to learn from there to Pesach Dorot. And Pesach Dorot, so how do we know? There it says tishmeru, so we're going to learn it from Pesach. But Pesach Dorot, how do we know that it's the case? We're going to say Pesach Dorot nami haktiv avadata et avodah zot b'chodesh hazeh. And this is going to be our mantra for the next 7 questions, for the upcoming 6 questions, which is, it also says you should do, this is a pasuk, okay, you have to understand the context. Without understanding the context, this doesn't make sense. In pasuk, in Shmot Yud Gimel, pasuk Hey, it says, V'haya ki v'yacha Hashem el eretz haknani achiti, etc. When you get to the land of Israel, basically, it says, V'avadata et avodah zot b'chodesh hazeh. What's the topic of that pasuk? Future generations of Pesach, right? After giving all the laws of Pesach this year, when they were getting out of Egypt, then God said, and when you get to the land, you have to keep this every year. Now, how did they darshan this pasuk? It says, do the avodah in this month. in future years. Now, again, the pshat means do it in Nisan. Why would you think to do it any other day? I don't know. And that's why maybe they darshan this. Why does it say hazeh? Sheyehu kol avodot chodesh zeh kazeh. All the avodot related to the sacrificing of the animal are all going to be the same as this year. Okay, now obviously, except for purchasing it, right? Maybe you say purchasing isn't really part of the avodah, but in the end, we're going to say that is the one unique law where it says zeh, and it meant this year, not other years. But here we're going to say zeh means, right, kazeh, like this. So when you do it in future generations, it's going to be all the details as before. So basically what we're going to do now is every time, right? So it says, now what's the issue? Well, that verse said, we're still trying to figure out this, shamartem vayalachem lemishmeret ad arba'asar, right? And then the whole pasuk was, ad arba'asar yom lechodesh hazeh. And we thought hazeh maybe meant just this year, but no, because avad het avodah azot means you have to do it, meaning watch that animal for 40 days, make sure it's not blemished. Otherwise, you're going to have an issue with the sacrifice. That obviously applies for future generations. And from there, they learn to the Korban Tamid. What's left to figure out? What do we do with the word zeh then? Zeh definitely is coming to exclude something. So what's the zeh coming to exclude? Ela hahu hazeh. Lemiute Pesach Sheni dekavate. Oh, it's to exclude Pesach Sheni. It's to say Pesach Sheni doesn't have this law. Okay? So Pesach Sheni is more similar to it. That's why it's coming to exclude something that's more similar rather than something that's different, which is Pesach Dorot. Okay, so there they say, right, it's excluding Pesach Sheni. Pesach Sheni, you don't need to watch the animal for 4 days. And by the way, likewise, not other sacrifices, only the Tamid and the Pesach, because of this Ksera Shav. Ela me'ata. So now we're going to start going. This is much simpler, the next list. That was a little bit of a complicated one. That's why I said I left it out of the chart. But now we're going to have a slew of questions, 6 questions, where each time we're going to quote a verse about a detail about the Korban Pesach. We're going to say, this seems limiting, which might mean maybe they only did it in Pesach of that year when they got out of Egypt. Every time they're going to answer, what do you mean? It says, va'avadta et avodah azot b'chodesh hazeh, right? Zeh is like, they're not even going to repeat the whole answer. But zeh means you do it like you did it, right? Because you have to do avodah hazot, right? This avodah, do it the same way you did it then. And then they're going to say, so what was that word coming to exclude then? It must be excluding something else, and we'll see what it is in each case. So we'll start off with Ela me'ata dechtiv v'achlu et habasar balayla hazeh, and you should eat the meat that night. So hachanami dezen echal balayla ve'en acher ne'echal balayla. It sounds like this year you have to eat it at night, but maybe in future generations you don't because of the word zeh. So now they say Amar Kra. The pasuk says va'avadta et avodah, and again they don't even go through the whole thing, but obviously all the details about it have to be specifically for that year, for that eaten that night. Right? Just like they did in Mitzrayim. Ela hazeh lamali. So what do we do with the word hazeh, which seems limiting? It's for some other machloket. The Gemara doesn't even go into it. This is a machloket we saw in the very beginning of Masechet Brachot in Daf Tet, when it talks about the first Mishnah of Shas talks about till when can you say Kriyat Shema at night? And there's either till Chatzot or till the morning. And there's one of the things they bring here is this machloket Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, it says balayla hazeh, and it says God's going to bring kill the firstborns. Avarti balayla hazeh. And when did God do that? At midnight. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, therefore you can only eat the Korban Pesach till midnight. It's the same halayla hazeh. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, that's not the case. He says it's like he says it has to do with b'chipazon. And you eat it b'chipazon, which we saw that you have to eat it b'chipazon, and b'chipazon. When did they leave? At alot hashachar. So he says you get till alot hashachar. You have till early morning hours, right before sunrise, but you get at least till alot hashachar, and that's what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah takes hazeh to say, just like the hazeh by the killing of the firstborn is midnight. Therefore, this is also midnight, and that's the machloket that we keep referring to about can you eat the Korban Pesach until midnight. Or can you eat it till the morning? This is why many people try to eat the afikomen, right? There's a halacha, you're supposed to eat the afikomen until chatzot, not past midnight, which by the way, doesn't come out usually exactly 12 o'clock. It's often even before, depending on where you're living and what your time is. But that's based on the idea that the afikomen is keneged the Korban Pesach, which is a debate about that. But anyway, that's a whole interesting issue, and that comes from here. Ela me'ata dechtiv. So second question here of our 6. Again, it's really of 7, but I kind of separated. Then the chol harei lo yochal bo. Anyone who's uncircumcised can't eat it. So again, it sounds specific, just it. Hachanami deboino ochel aval ochel bepesach torot. So again, does that mean that an arel, uncircumcised person, can't eat the korban pesach, but he can eat it, right? Not in Mitzrayim, but he could eat it in future generations? No, amar krav avadita. No, that's part of the general rule. Ela bo lamali. So what do we need the bo for? Boino ochel aval ochel b'matzah marur. He can't eat the korban pesach, but he can eat matzah marur if he wants. Okay, that's not forbidden to him. Ela me'ata. What about the fact that it says any ben nechar, which is presumably someone who left the religion? Now, normally someone who leaves the religion is still considered Jewish. If you convert out, you're still considered Jewish by Jewish law, which should mean you should be able to eat it. But dafka, when it comes to the korban pesach, because you've left the religion and the korban pesach is such a central tenet of our beliefs of becoming a nation, and you're basically saying, I don't want to be part of this nation, so you can't eat the korban pesach. But now, again, it says lo yochal bo, which seems like maybe only bo. Hachanami, deboino ochel, aval ochelu pesach lidorot. Maybe you could eat for future generations. Amarkra va'avadita. Again, it includes. So it is relevant for all future years. So ela bo lamali, bo hamarat dat poselet ve'ein hamarat dat poselet betruma. This is only an issue for the korban pesach. You can't eat the korban pesach. But the same issue, if you became an apostate, you would be able to eat truma still. That doesn't preclude you from eating truma. Just the korban pesach, meaning just this mitzvah. Both those psukim were necessary, and you wouldn't have been able to learn one from the other. Why? If you just had uncircumcised, you would have said mishum de ma'is. It's considered despicable to be uncircumcised. But aval, because you haven't removed the orla, the foreskin, that's considered something ma'us by the Gemara. Aval ben nechar lo ma'is. But someone who's an apostate isn't considered like he did something disgusting. It's not the same type of thing. Eimalo, you might have thought maybe it's not relevant. That's why you need both. And if you just had the apostate, because he doesn't believe in God anymore. The uncircumcised person doesn't mean he doesn't believe in God. He just hasn't done a circumcision for whatever reason. But that's different. Maybe he could still be part of the korban pesach. Therefore, it's coming to tell you both of them cannot. That's why you need both. Okay, next pasuk. This whole next section, Rashi removes because it really doesn't make any sense. I'll read it, but because it's not in parentheses, which basically means take it out of the text, but it seems like it really should be taken out because you'll see it doesn't make sense. Alameata. Toshav v'sachir lo yochal bo. Okay, the pshat, the real, this sounds like it's saying the pasuk. Okay, I want us to really understand what the pasuk is saying. Toshav v'sachir usually mean the Eved Ivri is a toshav if he's 6 years in Eved Ivri, right, and goes free on the 7th. Or a sachir is someone who becomes hired, like to stay. He wants to stay with his master. He pierces his ear and gets to stay until the Yovel year. Both of those, it says lo yochabo, which really doesn't make any sense because they can't eat the korban pesach. So this pasuk itself is difficult. Hachanami dibo eno ochel aval ochel hu bepesach torot. So are we going to say again only for Mitzrayim he couldn't eat it, but he could for future generations? So Amar Krav Avata, no, it's relevant for future generations also. Ela bo lamali. So now it even becomes stranger, the Gemara, because we already learned this from the Ben Nechal. It's to teach you. And what does hamarat dat, leaving the religion, have anything to do with a toshav and a sachir? They're not people who left the religion. So that's why Rashi says this really doesn't make any sense. So let's move on from there. Elameata umalta oto az yochalbo. This is an interesting halacha. Not only if you're uncircumcised, and not only does your servants, right, your Canaanite slaves and your children need to be uncircumcised, but if you're in a house, you're the head of the household and they're not circumcised, you can't eat the korban pesach also. So it says you should give them a brit milah, and then you can eat the korban pesach if you take care of it. So again, it says bo. So hachanami debo eno ochel v'alochel b'pesach torot. It sounds like maybe just that year you couldn't eat it, but in future generations you could. Amar krava avadita. So ela bo lamali. What's the bo then coming for? Bo milat charav avadav ma'akevet ve'em milat charav avadav ma'akevet betruma. It's to tell you again, this issue that you don't have your slaves or your children circumcised is only an issue for korban pesach. It's not an issue for eating truma. Ela me'ata dechti ve'etzem lo yishperu bo. What about breaking a bone? Hachanami. This actually we learned this drasha already, but hachanami debo eno shover aval shover b'pesach torot. Again, it sounds like bo would be limiting, maybe only in Pesach that year they got out. So no, again, they say, Amar Krava Avadata. So Ela Bo Lamali, what are you doing with that word bo? Bo b'kasher v'lo b'pasul. Remember, don't break a bone in it, meaning only if it's a kosher Pesach. But if it became disqualified for whatever reason, then there's no forbidden. If you break a bone, you're not going to get karet for it. Lashes for it. You get lashes. Now we're moving to a different word. We started with zeh, then we moved to all the references of the word bo, right? Again, like I said, all these are words that limit this, right? This, that. The third word is mimenu, from it. From it sounds like just it. Al tuchlu mimenu na. Don't eat it raw. Remember, which we said is partially raw. Mimenu yata ochel aval ata ochel na bepesach torot. Maybe you could eat it raw in future generations. Amarkra va'avadata. Again, the pasuk says va'avadata. Ela mimenu lamali. So what do you need that for? And again, they don't tell you what this is for, but this is, he makes a Gzeira Shava from here to Pesach to Maser Sheni, and he learns from there that just like an Arel can't eat here, an Arel can't eat there, and that's what he uses that pasuk for. Okay, so therefore the Mimenu is to teach you about that, because their Mimenu also appears. Now we're moving on to the next issue in the Mishnah. Ne'echal b'chipazon. Menalan, how do we know that only Pesach Mitzrayim was eaten b'chipazon? And it's a good question why they don't ask the same, why they don't bring the drasha avadata here and said, oh, this really applies across the board. Again, a word that limits. Only that year they had to eat it rushed and not in future generations. Now you would have expected the Gemara to say, what about va'avadata, right? They don't say that for probably a number of reasons. Number one, they probably knew, right? Sometimes they come at these halachot, or mostly they come knowing the answer. They knew the chipazon wasn't included in future generations, whereas with all the other things, they knew they were included, right? Who's going to say, breaking bones is not forbidden in future generations? We already had lots of halachic discussions about it. So again, they use the drashot as they need them to help them to understand, right, why we do what we do. Another thing is chipazon, you could say, is very different because they didn't have time to let their bread rise, right? They had to rush out. Makes sense in that year they'd have to rush. Could you imagine if we had to rush through our Seder, right? It's the exact opposite of what everybody does. If we had to eat b'chipazon that night, right, our Seders would look very different. Okay, next. Pesach dorot noheg kol shiva. Now we get to the part in the Mishnah that made no sense, right? Because the Mishnah said, Pesach, right? First they're starting with the last line, really, even though we didn't really deal with B'layla Echad, which really both are eaten at Layla Echad. And then it says, Pesach dorot noheg kol shiva. And what are you talking about? Korban Pesach, we don't eat all 7 days. So Amai Kai, what's it referring to? Ilema Pesach, Pesach kol shiva mi'ikai. If it's talking about Pesach, we don't do Pesach all 7 days. Ela achametz. So maybe it's talking about chametz, because right, think about what is true all 7 days, chametz. But Michlal de Pesach Mitzrayim Laila Echad Betulo. Wait, what did it say? And they assume the Mishnah reads like this: Ne'achal b'chipazon b'layla echad. In other words, one is Ne'achal b'chipazon, the next is b'layla echad versus Pesach, which is all 7. So now they're going to say it sounds like chametz is one night in the days they got out of Mitzrayim, and right that they were only forbidden not to eat chametz for that one night. And Pesach, in Pesach D'Lidorot, we don't eat chametz for 7 days. Well, what's the problem with that? Now, it's not a problem because they really didn't eat chametz all 7 days, but they also didn't eat it only one night. Chametz was forbidden the entire day, and we're going to learn that right now. So Laila Echad Betulo, just that night and not anymore. Really, it was forbidden the entire first day and only the first day. They didn't have 7 days that first year. Tanya, doesn't it say in a Braita? Rabbi Yossi Aglili Yomel. How do you know it's only one day? Talmud Lomar lo yachal chametz. V'samechle. This is what we did yesterday. We kept darshaning psukim that appear next to each other. Hayom atem yotzin. Right. Today you're leaving. So there we have today connected with don't eat chametz because today you're leaving. That means you can't eat chametz the entire day when you're getting out of the year they got out of Egypt. Ela hachi kamar. So now they say, okay, so it must be the Mishnah reads differently, and they've changed the words a little bit. They say, Laila Echad, okay, the Korban Pesach is eaten Laila Echad, V'hu adin lePesach Dorot, and that is actually true for future generations. That's not a difference, even though the Mishnah only mentioned differences, so it's a little bit strange, but okay. Then they say, V'chimutzo kol hayom, and they add in these words. And Isur Chametz, they do segue into Chametz, but you have to add words then. The Isur Chametz in Pesach Dorot was one whole day. Pesach Dorot nohei kol shiva. In future generations, it's all 7. And that's how they understand the Mishnah, because otherwise you really have trouble understanding what the Mishnah is talking about. I'll just throw it out there before we finish this topic, which is there's a question really about why is it important to distinguish and know, right? Sometimes the Gemara says, "My dahava hava," what was, like who really cares how different Pesach Mitzrayim was from Pesach Dorot? So it's a good question why the Gemara goes into this. Why they want to know so badly, what happened and what were the differences. Pesach Rishon, Pesach Sheni, we totally understand because that's, again, it wasn't exactly relevant in their day, but it will be relevant in future generations when we get the temple back. But this is not going to be relevant ever. We'll never go back to Pesach Mitzrayim. So it's interesting that they have a whole section dealing with it. Okay, now we're moving on to another topic, which is in a case where I separate an animal for the Korban Pesach. Then I lose that animal. And then I pick a different one in its stead. And then now the question is, what if I find the first animal? I now have two animals designated for Korban Pesach. Depending on when I find it, will affect whether it becomes disqualified or not. Okay, if you remember, if you have a Korban Pesach, you have an animal that you didn't end up using for the Korban Pesach, we say it reverts, it becomes a shlamim the following day. And you can sacrifice it as a Korban shlamim. So the question is, what if, now there's something called dichui, which is if something gets rejected though, then you can't bring it as a sacrifice. So let's start reading the Mishnah, but before we even get to the Mishnah, we have to say one more thing, which is there another halacha, and the Mishnah is combining two things here, which is if I say I have an animal that's designated for a korban, and I say in place of that animal, I want to take a different animal. I don't want that animal. I decided I want to slaughter that animal and eat it myself, and I want to bring a different animal for a korban. You're not allowed to do this. This is what's called tmura. There's a whole masechet tmura about this. And not only you're not allowed to do it, but, or I shouldn't say not only, but even though you're not allowed to do it, it's actually effective. What does it mean it's effective? Well, it's not effective to the sense that I could take the kedusha, the sanctity, off of one animal and put it on the other. No. Once that first animal is sanctified, it's sanctified forever. That's what we call kedushat haguf. The body of the korban, the animal is sanctified. But if I try to substitute, it's called substitution. I try to substitute a different animal in its stead, then both become sanctified and I have to sacrifice them both as korbanot. So let's say I have a regular korban shlamim and I said, I want to take this one instead. I have to sacrifice them both as a korban shlamim. So now I can't do that on Pesach. I can't sacrifice two as a korban Pesach because you can't sacrifice two korban Pesachs. So the question is, what's the law? Now here we're going to get into now we're going to talk about here a substitution of the original one that was lost and then found. And the question is, when did it get found? What's the law for that? And what's the law for a substitution of that animal? That's going to be our topic. Okay, it's a little bit confusing, but try to organize it so hopefully it won't be too confusing. I'm a Rabbi Yeshua, and you'll see that even Rabbi Yeshua was confused by this. Shamati, so in case you're feeling confused, don't worry, he was also. Shamati shetmurat pesach chayva. I heard that there's sometimes where Tmurat Pesach becomes sacrifice and sometimes where it doesn't, and I don't understand which case. I don't remember or I don't understand. I'm a Rabbi Akiva ani afaresh. So Rabbi Akiva comes in and says, I'll explain it to you. HaPesach, now you think the topic is Tmura, but really he's going to say, we're really talking about a Pesach that got lost and then a Tmura on that one. Okay? Again, a substitution. So Rabbi Akiva says, let me explain. HaPesach. If I separate an animal on Monday, Tuesday is the day I'm supposed to bring the Korban Pesach, and Tuesday I lose the animal. And then Tuesday, before I slaughter I take a new animal instead. Before I slaughter animal number 2, I find animal number 1. So now what happens when I'm going to slaughter the Pesach, I have 2 in front of me and I'm choosing one and I'm rejecting the other. That means if I take animal 2 and I don't take animal 1 becomes called rejected. Dichui it's called. This is rejected. Once it's rejected, this animal can never, this is a very interesting halacha, the animal can never be used as a sacrifice anymore because we don't want to bring God's a reject. Okay, so it's a reject. Now, therefore, since it's a reject, normally a Pesach would become a shlamim. But we can't sacrifice this korban because it's a reject. So what do we do with it? Whatever we do with korbanot when we get stuck with something that has kedushat haguf, it's the body of the animal is sanctified. So you can't get rid of that sanctity. But you also can't sacrifice it. So yireh ad sheyisteiv. You leave it to graze in a certain area until it gets a blemish. Once it's blemished, it no longer can be brought on the altar, then we can sell it. So yimacher, so we sell it v'yavi b'tamav shlamim. You now take the money and you buy a shlamim because a Pesach turns into a shlamim, but you can't actually sacrifice it. So you take the money and you put it into a shlam. V'chein tmurato, and the same thing if you take that same animal and you substitute a different animal in its stead. Now, it's not clear exactly when all this happened, but let's assume right now, you found it before the Pesach, and you did a tmura before you slaughtered the other one, and they were both in existence when you slaughtered it. So both become rejected and both have to be leaved to graze. The whole debate in the Gemara is going to be, Rav is going to say when did the tmura happen? That's not exactly spelled out in the Mishnah. Achar shchitat Pesach, but if it was after it was already slaughtered, you now find the first animal. Well, that animal was never rejected. Now you all of a sudden have an animal that you separated for a Pesach and you never used. It didn't get rejected because when you slaughtered the other animal, it wasn't even there. You couldn't have even slaughtered it. So it never got rejected. If that's the case, you can just automatically make it a korban shlamim without a problem. You don't have to leave it to graze. So achar shchitat Pesach karev shlamim v'chein tmurato, and the same thing with the substitution for that. So now first the Gemara asks, v'lema Pesach karevu Pesach eno karev. Really, you're talking about a Pesach that got lost. You're not talking about the whole topic of the Mishnah isn't tmura. So why did Rabbi Yehoshua start off with tmura? That was like an added part. So they say hakamash v'lan tmura Pesach de lo kreva, because they wanted you to know that sometimes you could have. They wanted you to teach you an additional something. They wanted to get both. That also sometimes you can have a substitution that also doesn't get sacrificed. Itmar. Now we have a machloket amoraim about how to read the Mishnah. Rabba Amar Kodem Shchita Ula Achar Shchita Shaninu. Rabbi Zera, okay, he reads the Mishnah like we do. That's fine. Rabbi Zera Amar Kodem Chatzot Ula Achar Chatzot Shaninu. It's not the moment of slaughtering that causes the other animal to be rejected. It's the time of Chatzot. When Chatzot kicks in midday, that's when you're obligated to slaughter the Korban Pesach. At that point, that's when it matters. Are they both here or not? If they're both here, then one's going to be rejected. If they're not both here, then not. So it's not about when you slaughtered it. It's all about the moment of midday. That's what determines, oh, now it's a reject. Well, the Rabbi Zera, Haksani Kodem Shchita Pesach, but it says before Shchita. So why would it say that if it meant before the time of? So he says, Ema Kodem Zman Shchita Pesach. He says, understand it as the time and not the actual slaughter. Kitinai, this is actually a machloket Tanaim, the same machloket that they have. HaPesach Shenimtza Kodem Shchita Yir'eh. La'achar shchita yikav, that's Rabba, like our Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer Amar Omer Kodem Chatzot Yir'eh La'achar Chatzot Yikav. He says it's all dependent on the time. Achar shchita Pesach Yavish Shlamim. Now we're going to read Rabba. Okay, and for this, it's very helpful if you look at the chart to understand better. Amar Rabba Lo Shanu Ela. The whole Mishnah is only Shenimtza Achar Shchita V'hi Mirbo Achar Shchita. This is how I explain the Mishnah. Everything happened after Shchita. Okay, both the Tmura, and now we're talking about the second case here. Okay, where it was found after Shchita and the substitution was done after Shchita. But Nimtza Kodem Shchita, what if you found the animal before Shchita? So the animal becomes rejected, but Himirbo Achar Shchita, but you only did the substitution after the time of Shchita. So now the Tmura is on a sacrifice that was rejected, but it was not in existence when we slaughtered the animal. So what do we say? Tmuratom. Now, the logic could go either way, and that's what we're going to see in the two variations of Rava. Tmuratom mikodesh kedusha dechuya ka'ate velo karva. Meaning, the sanctity of this Tmura comes from an animal that was rejected. So again, Tmura means it's going to have the same status as the original animal. The original animal was rejected because the original animal was in existence at the time of Shchita. So it got rejected. Even though you're doing your Tmura later, after you've already sacrificed your Pesach, and clearly you can't mean this Tmura is going to be a Pesach, because it was already, but you're doing it on a rejected animal, kind of like the Imurim only came from the Basar. This one only came from the rejected animal. So this one is also going to be after left to graze. So Eitiv Abaye. Abaye asks the question. He says the following. Im Kesev. Okay, now we're on a different thing, which is Psukim about Shlamim. It talks about if you want to bring it from a Kesev, right, which is a lamb, or if you want to bring it from an ez, which is a goat. So, or im kesev, or a sheep. Im kesev, right? The kesev is from the sheep family. Ma tamud lomar im kesev, l'rabot murat pesach achar pesach shekreva shlamim. Okay, it's to teach you. Why does it say the word im kesev? It's to teach you that murat pesach after pesach is a shlamim. Now, hechidami, what's the case of this? What's the case of this? Ilema, if it's shenimtzal achar shchita, after you already slaughtered it, v'himir bo achar shchita, in other words, you lost the animal, you found the animal after shchita, so it was never rejected, and then you did a tmura on it, Pshita, lama likra, you don't need a special drasha for this. El alav, it must be shenimtza kodem shchita v'himir bo la'achar shchita. It must be that you found it. It must be exactly our case, that there's a special drasha to teach you that it's also krevash shlamim. If you found it before shchita and you did the tmura after shchita, since it wasn't in existence at the time of shchita, it's not rejected against what Rava said, even though its power comes from a rejected animal. So they reject Abaye's question by saying lo. La'olam shenimtza achar shchita v'himir bo achar shchita. No, it really was. It was found after shchita, and it was after, and the tmura was after shchita, which means none of them were rejected. But then, kra asmachta ba'alma. Oh, you said it's pshita? The pasuk wasn't coming for that. That's just a way the rabbis connected it to a pasuk to say there's an extra thing that's brought as shlamim. What is that? A tmura of an animal that was rejected and that was lost and found after shechita, wasn't rejected, and therefore they all could be sacrificed as shlamim. It's just a way to connect it to the verse, so you remember it's not really what the verse is talking about. To which the Gemara says, and we'll finish with this, and we'll get tomorrow to the second version of Rava. To which the Gemara now says, if that's the case, kralamayata. So what do we need this pasuk for then? And they're going to darshan this pasuk and the next pasuk, which says ve'im ez. Okay, so if it's a kesef or it's an ez, why do they bring you all these details? So they say, Kiditanya, Kesev l'rabot et pesach la'aliyah. Kesev is to teach you that if you bring a sheep for the korban pesach, you have to burn its tail on the altar, because all sheep that are shlamim get their tails burnt, and pesach is like that also. Kishu omer im kesev. Now that was from the word kesev. What about im kesev? L'rabot pesach shavra shnato u'shlamim abeim achma pesach l'chol mitzvat shlamim. This is to teach you that when a pesach, you bring the wrong kind of animal for a Pesach, it's too old or something is wrong about it, it automatically becomes shlamim. And in that case, we'll get to that in a few days. What's the rules? The rules are, it's like a shlamim, full-fledged shlamim, meaning all the rules about shlamim that don't apply to Pesach are going to apply to that, like smicha, nisachim, these extra things you bring with it, the libations, tnufat chazev v'shok, you wave the two parts that you give to the kohanim. Ukishehu omer, and the last part of this is ve'im ez, the next pasuk, hifsika inyan. There's like a break here. It says, and if it's a goat, so now why does it stop? To teach you, limen ala ez she'ein te'unal yatz, to separate and to say this thing about the tail doesn't apply to goats. Okay. With that, we'll finish for today. That was the first reading of Rava of the Mishnah. Tomorrow we'll start with Rava's second reading of the Mishnah, and how this, according to the second reading, he reads it differently and comes to a very different, the opposite conclusion as we saw today. And on that, Abai is also going to have a question, and we'll get to that tomorrow. Have an easy fast, everybody. And like I said, for Purim, we're on as usual. So same time for the Zoom, and the classes will be up as usual for Purim.